right, so I don't think any beef farmer in Ontario or in Canada in general will ever forget May 20th, 2003, because for a lot of farmers, the world ended that day for a period of a number of months. I think that what had happened was that there was an animal detected in Alberta the week before. It had gone through a number of tests. Those tests take several days to do. Over the May 24th long weekend in Canada, the weekend before, the tests were ongoing. The Monday was a holiday, and those test results were confirmed on the Monday. The Canadian Cattlemen's Association, the organization that represents 90,000 Canadian beef farmers, had gotten word Monday night, but weren't allowed to tell anybody about the announcement until Tuesday morning. At the time, I was working for the Ontario Cattlemen's Association. We represented Ontario's 21,000 beef farmers, and I know when I went to work on that Tuesday morning, I had absolutely no idea what was about to happen to me. Nobody in our office did. I was actually on a photo shoot doing a photography shoot for a new, ironically, food safety program in the Ontario beef industry in London, Ontario, when I got a phone call standing in a farmer's field from somebody who said, "We've just heard on the news that there's a case of mad cow." And of course I told them they had to be absolutely crazy because I would have heard about it, and that wasn't the case. From then on, the rest of that day was a complete blur. Trying to get a hold of my office in Guelph, trying to make the 2-hour trip back from where I was to the photo shoot to my office, trying to figure out along that route what we were going to be doing in the next 12 to 15 hours, and starting the communications plan that would take us through the next year. I would say that the economic impact was immediate and devastating. Prior to, say, May the 19th, 2003, farmers were getting about $1.10 Canadian a pound for their animals. The day after mad cow hit, they were getting about 30 cents a pound in Canadian dollars for their animals. So in the years to follow, I talked to public groups, school groups, consumers, and said, just imagine if without any sort of warning, your paycheck dropped by 2/3, what would you do in that case if you had absolutely no warning? And that's the case. The value of the Canadian beef industry prior to this was about $20 billion annually. They figure that the Canadian beef industry lost about $6 billion that first year. And the Canadian beef industry is very export driven. We export. Prior to BSE, we exported better than 50% of our product outside of Canada. Our biggest client obviously is the United States and Asia, and that market was immediately stopped. So we had to find places for all of that beef. We had to look after those cattle because they still needed fed, whether farmers could afford to feed them or not, and the ramifications just kept going on and on and on. 2 years prior to BSE hitting Canada, the Ontario beef industry faced another communications crisis. There was a water contamination issue in a town called Walkerton, Ontario, where 7 people died and hundreds of people were hospitalized or became ill because of E. coli getting into their water source. As the beef industry is very familiar, the strain of E. coli called O157H7 comes from beef cattle, and it was a case where contamination from a beef farm got into a water system and infected that town's, it affected that whole town's future and life, and 7 of its residents died. At the time, the Ontario beef industry had never faced anything like that. It was not the beef industry's fault that that happened. There was negligence on the part of water control officials, and that was long proven afterwards that it wasn't the beef industry's issue. But at the time, we could have done a lot more to be proactive in terms of communication. When the media first got word that it was O157H7 strain of E. coli that had hit that water crisis, or hit that water system, the beef industry stayed quiet. And I remember being advised by my bosses, by my board of directors, just keep our heads low and nobody will notice that we're here. The issue will go away. And we absolutely got hammered by the media. Even though it wasn't the beef industry's fault, we weren't responsive, we weren't there to answer media questions. Our typical response was no comment when we were called, and we spent years recovering from that, and I don't think communications-wise the beef industry or agriculture in general in Ontario has ever recovered. So that was 2 years prior to Walkerton hitting. And ironically, it was the exact same weekend, 2 years later, our May-long weekend here in Canada, that BSE hit. In those 2 years, I think agriculture as a whole did a pretty good job of saying, here's what we could have done better in Walkerton. We needed to be there, we needed to be responsive, we needed to put our names in front of the media, because we all know that if we don't respond to a crisis, our activist organizations, anti-agricultural organizations are quite happy to speak on our behalf. And their messaging isn't accurate, it isn't fair, it doesn't represent who we are and what we do. So in the 2 years after Walkerton, we started to put together a plan, things we needed to have in place before our next crisis hit. We needed things like fact sheets. We had no background information on things like E. coli 0157H7, BSE, foot and mouth disease, because that had hit the United Kingdom in the years since. We need to have information ready so that when the media called us and said, we need to know more about this particular topic, we had the fact sheets that we knew were accurate and ready to go. We needed French language spokespeople. Canada's a bilingual country. We had French language television stations and radio stations calling our office. We had nobody able to speak to those broadcast outlets in the language that they wanted their broadcasts. We needed websites ready to go, dark websites as an example, websites that we could have live in a couple of hours with the latest facts and figures on things like BSE, and we didn't have any of that. And we needed trained spokespeople. Having spoke to the media numerous times in those years, we knew that they didn't necessarily want to talk to a trained, hired staff person in an office in Guelph, where my office was located. They wanted to talk to a farmer affected by the crisis. And having done Walkerton, I knew that my farmers weren't trained in talking to the media. They weren't comfortable in talking to the media. So in the years after Walkerton, we identified farmers all across Ontario, larger producers, small producers with smaller operations, male, female, part-time farmers, full-time farmers, all ages, and brought them in and did extensive media training. And all of those things then were ready for when the BSE crisis hit. So going back to Walkerton, I think the problem during the Walkerton crisis was there was no balance in the media. Because agriculture chose not to speak up and chose not to defend itself, the biases against agriculture were just so obvious, and the reporting was very one-sided. After BSE hit, I think that one of our biggest success stories was getting our stories out to the public, and you saw the media respond tenfold with that. They were so grateful to have us putting our information out, sending out that press release in day one saying, here we are, we're speaking on behalf of the farmers, call us anytime you need us, and they really used that. And I think as a result of that, we saw great balance in the media. The BSE crisis didn't become a media scare. People realized that this was one animal in 14 million animals in the country, and that it hadn't made it into the food chain. There was no risk, and the media did a fabulous job of conveying that to the public. As a result, we're the only country in the world to have ever seen consumption of beef rise after a food crisis like that, because the media did such a good job of putting the farmers' statements out there and saying, this is not a food safety issue, this is an economic issue, crisis for us, but here's what's really going on. And I can't say enough good things about the media during this crisis, because they got it. They did a great job of conveying how this was affecting Canadian farmers, and also at the same time doing a really good job of saying this is not a food safety issue.